ICD conference is happening virtually. Oh, that's nice. And you have a paper there Monday. So that was the one you were showing us earlier in the at a prior meeting. Yeah, those papers. Well, good luck. Yeah, that's pretty good. And so this is like a pretty nice conference. What kinds of topics do they cover? I'm not familiar with the acronym. Okay, in data engineering. Okay, International Conference on Data Engineering. Okay. That's pretty good. Well, congratulations on that, and good luck on your talk. It's always kind of hard getting things in place at the last minute on a talk, trying to figure out how to best communicate things. So, and obviously in this group we've worked on things like that, trying to get them optimized. All right, I'm going to start, and I'm going to do this primarily for the benefit of people watching online. We'll be recording this and putting this online. And then if people come in later, we'll kind of loop them in, summarize what went on since what they missed. So welcome to today's meeting. Hope everyone's doing well with the pandemic and with other items that they might be busy with. If we have a lot of things actually on tap for today, a lot of small items. The first is that I want to cover a new thing called the Wolfram Physics Project. And then we'll talk about some papers. We might get into some of the discussion on double descent. So I know Devansh in particular missed that last week, but we'll kind of go over it a little bit. Then the metabrain models, which these repos, the metabrain models that I'm going to cover, are relevant to this summer's GSoC. So we will have people who want to be involved with the GSoC project this summer can kind of tune into that, and we'll cover that maybe next week as well. I'll go over the CSV Conf presentation that will be given in about a month, and then cover a feature on John Conway, who died last week. And so I'll move this up actually. Okay, so let me share my screen. This is primarily for Devansh's benefit, but I'm going to share it. Everyone will be able to see it. Okay. Here's Ankit. Well, Ankit.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Yeah. Yes.
How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm just fine.
Good.
And,
So I was kind of going through the agenda for the recording, and so we'll just walk through the agenda. You didn't really miss anything. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the Wolfram Physics Project. So this is a project that was actually announced this week by Stephen Wolfram. Stephen Wolfram is a mathematician who started his career pretty early in life, and he was really famous, or really a luminary in mathematics early on, like in his late teens, early 20s. And he was, he wrote a lot of papers and everything. And then he decided he was going to start a software company. And if you've heard of the Mathematica software, that's his company. And so he worked on Mathematica for a while, and then he started writing this book. And it's on cellular automata. So he sat in a room for like 10 years and wrote this book. It's really thick, maybe 1,200 pages long, and it's called A New Kind of Science. And A New Kind of Science really, well, I don't know how groundbreaking it was. It definitely put some really good ideas out there about computation and about, the fundamental nature of computation. If you can take like a model like a cellular automata and model anything in nature. And so he's a strong proponent that you can use computational tools to find out about anything in nature, that any system is reducible to this sort of computational thinking, like, a Turing machine, basically. So maybe the brain is a Turing machine in this case, or cities are Turing machines. It's just if you have to look, at the fundamental structure, you'll see that, basically it is like a Turing machine. That's his argument. So it's pretty controversial in a lot of ways. But then he's been working on like a new kind of science in Mathematica, and he's sort of gotten into this space now of collaborative science, and that's where the Wolfram Physics Project comes in. So they're actually talking about a lot of the stuff from a new kind of science in this project. But more importantly, this is a project that's sort of very open source, where people can learn physics on their own time. They can learn a lot about physics and fundamental theory. And he's actually claimed to have come up with a new way of looking at fundamental physics, or a new way of discovering things in fundamental physics. So that part might be a little bit more controversial. But the part that's really, I think, the best part of this is just seeing this all go kind of online, where he's got live stream lectures, and he's got people collaborating, and there's software tools in place. So if you're interested in this sort of open science, this sort of collaborative science, you should check this out. It's wolframphysics.org. And there's a lot of stuff on YouTube that's already been going on in terms of live streaming. And they're working, they have working materials like notebooks and other things. So technical documentation. So it's definitely something to watch. I don't know how successful they'll be, but there's Ziyi. Hello, Ziyi. So that's the Wolfram Physics Project. So yeah, that's something. And then the next thing is that John Conway, who was a very famous mathematician, died this last week. So there were a lot of tributes to him. Okay, so this is a good example of a tribute. So he's known for this thing called the Game of Life, and this is the Game of Life. It's a
I'm aware of this.
Okay, so
I remember suddenly.
Yeah. So this is a cellular automaton. So it's just talking about that. And each one of these cells is a computational unit, and it has a state, turns on and off. And but the state is determined by what its neighbors are doing. So this cell here is off, and its neighbors are off. This cell is on, and some of its neighbors are on, but some of them are off. And so the idea of a cellular automaton is you can play with, it's kind of like a neural network. You play with the weights of the neighbors. So are the neighbors on or off? Well, it's maybe a probabilistic thing, where you say some of the neighbors can be on and you go on. If maybe you can have a strong rule where all your neighbors have to be on for you to go on. And the great thing about that is it's propagative. So if you have something going on over here, it can propagate across the grid. And so that leads us to the Game of Life, which is a cellular automaton where you have these rules going on and you have cells going on and off. but in the process it forms patterns, shapes that look like things that are living, and more importantly, things that move across the grid. So they have these things called gliders, which are like these little things. They look kind of maybe like birds, and they go across the grid pretty quickly. And it's not that it's moving so much as that the activation of these cells is cascading across the grid. And so actually John Conway did a lot of other mathematical stuff, but that's what he's most known for is the game of life. And so I had some papers that, he's influenced a lot of people. So this is another example. This is a cartoon that shows kind of demonstrates the game of life, and it shows the gliders here. And then this is a picture of them. And they point out that it's in game theory parlance, this is something that's known as a 0-player game. So one-player games are like, solitaire or something like Game Against Nature, where you're trying to predict the weather. In this case, it's a 0-player game. So there are actually no players in this game. You just run the game, and there's on and off states that are being governed by rules, but there's no player per se. But it is a game in terms of competition between on and off states and things like that. So it's a really interesting class of game and really interesting class of simulation. There are a couple papers in this repository. This one is The Game of Life, The Enlightened Game of Life. And so this is actually a physics preprint. And they're talking, in this case, they're talking about a special case of cellular automata evolving in an environment filled by an electromagnetic wave. The rules of Conway's game of life are modified to account for the ability to retrieve life sustenance from the field energy. Life-induced self-structuring and self-healing abilities in various dynamic phases are displayed by the CA. Photo-driven genetic selection and nonlinear feedback of the CA on the electromagnetic field are included in the model. So this is like a model that's based on like electromagnetics, and they have some. So this is the kind of stuff that they get out of this game of life when they evolve it over time. So they apply these rules, and they treat the grid as an electromagnetic field, and they can get like quite exquisite patterns here, almost like snowflakes. And then let's see. Yeah, so that's basically what the paper is. That's one application that's pretty far afield of the original formulation of the game. The second one is this glider as cognition. So in this paper, we have a cognitive scientist who is using, he's looking at the cognitive domain of a glider. So a glider are these things that move across the grid. And they're basically treating the glider as something that might have cognition. And so they're looking at the reactions of these gliders. And they're kind of assessing things. They're putting it into a sort of a complex systems framework. I don't know if there are any figures in here to look at. Okay, so this is actually the cognitive domain of a glider. So this is a pretty complicated diagram here. Each glider configuration is labeled as described in the main text, and transitions between them are colored according to the class of perturbations that produce the transition. So perturbation is just something that happens that forces a change in the phenotype of the glider. So like how many cells are on, how many cells are off. The pattern is usually like transformed in some way. So it's either moved to the left or to the right, but it still maintains this coherent, shape of a glider. And so, it's a pretty, again, this is another interesting application. And then finally, you can look at this from what they call an epigenetic point of view, which is actually looking more at developmental biology. They look at two epigenetic models by Turing and Edelman, and then they realize these as game of life objects, which are like just putting these rules into the game of life. So the Turing epigenetic model is, I believe it's his reaction diffusion model of chemical morphogenesis, and then Edelman has a model of epigenetics. Gerald Edelman was a neuroscientist, won a Nobel Prize, and he wrote a series of books on neural Darwinism. So he was actually interested in like complex systems and things like that as well. It's neuroscience, and so they tested that as well. And this is a pretty good application, I think, of this idea. I haven't spent a lot of time reading it, but so yes, this is Turing's reaction diffusion morphogenesis model is used in this paper, and also I don't know if they get into the Edelman model at all. They also have a section in this paper, computer games as laboratories. So they talk a little bit about this platform called Golly, which is an open source platform developed for using like the game of life to look at different scientific problems. So yeah, so I mean, like my point with all this is that the game of life, John Conway's work has been very widely applied to different problems, especially this game of life. And if you want access to this folder, it has a lot of nice animations in it. If you want access to it, I can send you a link here in the chat.
And, so I had a question on this thing. Even like if we see this game of life of Conway's, and then we have our Breitenberg vehicles model. So what we do here is we just give a set of rules to some virtual environment, and we see some kind of emergent behavior coming out. So they are not exactly similar with the things that we see in nature, but they are a bit like they match some of the aspects of the things that happen in nature, in the ants and everything. But seems like this game of life is quite popular, and then our Breitenberg vehicle is so popular, and then Byte's algorithm is popular. But seems like in the real nature, that may be a mixture of all the algorithms, or some algorithm which we are not able to crack till now. So if something like that happens, it might just change the things.
Well, yeah, I think that's true. And so like all these algorithms that we've talked about in the group, Boyd's and Game of Life and all these are like, approximations of what's going on. So, you can, when you model something, you look at nature and you say, I need to be able to understand this by building a model. And I don't know how it works really, but I'm going to try to approximate it with some method. So like, you might use something that's like a very detailed model. You might use something that's very almost model free. Like, you just use like, you have a bunch of things that interact and you try to characterize the interactions and then replicate that on a computer. So what we're doing isn't necessarily, like people use the term lifelike, which means it's like life. But other than that, we don't have, like you can, actually there are papers where you can classify these types of models. I think in the artificial life literature, let me see if I can find that at some point. I might find it and send it to you. There's a paper on like classifying like lifelike things. And so, it's like the game of life is lifelike, Boyd's is lifelike. But what does that mean? Are there different classes of life? Some people think that, if it's able to adapt, it's lifelike. Or if it's like got if it's able to replicate its lifelike. So there are all these criterion that people use. But the
Mm-hmm.
idea is basically, and this goes for like neural models too, is that if it's, if it looks kind of like nature, if it looks like birds flocking,
Mm-hmm.
then it's probably a good model of it, birds flocking. But it's not, and it might tell you something about how it actually happens, but it's not the actual thing. And so I think that's a lot of biologists sometimes have a problem with these kind of models, is they say, well, it's not really life, it's not really realistic. And a lot of people answer and say, well, it's good enough to understand the what's going on inside the flock or the swarm or the emergent thing that you're trying to look at.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, that's the thing, and also like we are not actually look. I don't know if that is the thing that when we're just building a model for Britain vehicle, we don't know that something like that will emerge because like we are just. I think I don't know if the people the person who wrote it, he was doing some kind of experiment with all the kind of sensors and effectors and things like that, then suddenly something like that emerges. So these things are very interesting, but then what is the real application? It gives a lot of satisfaction in terms of your curiosity building and everything, but like the real application that I see is we make actually similar kind of robots or something like that. So and like it might also decode certain means nature's things that we don't know or something like that. So
yeah,
like in terms of research, how this is important, this kind of simulation building.
yeah. I mean, like with in terms of like simulating life, but also in terms of like you know, like in robotics, a lot of times they didn't have models of collective behavior before these type of models. So you'd
Mm-hmm.
have to like kind of figure out how to get robots say to work in teams, or like you couldn't really have you know uh, a good model of like collective behavior before these types of models were applied. So it was
Mm-hmm.
like you'd have to like kind of figure out from a rudimentary social model. I'm not exactly sure how they thought about it before like a lot of these emergent models came along, but they had a lot of like um, they had a lot of vague sociological metaphors that they used for building, like sort of envisioning how robots would work together, or
Mm-hmm.
how if you had a socio-technical system, how it might work with lots of people in it, and managing the flow of people or something. um, and so they didn't have a good model for it. But when these models came along, those were actually better approximations of collective behavior. And so actually, as one of the things that drove people to understand this was that you had problems of coordinating lots of people, or coordinating robot teams, or coordinating even like groups of computers. And so they didn't really have a model of it before this. And with this kind of model with collective behavior, people were able to do that more, and people do. Um, there are there are a number of groups using, as biological inspired methods to get at some of these control issues, because they're really not tractable by some conventional method where you use a lot of equations to sort of plan everything out.
Yeah.
Um, so it's much more feasible in terms of like the planning aspect, or at least getting to some answer about like how things are coordinated in amongst
Mm-hmm.
such large groups of agents.
Yeah. So like given we have one model of of a particular model, just like take case of Britain by vehicle, then we apply different variations on this. Like just like we are trying to put CJs into it last year, we wanted to do deep learning and genetic algorithm and all. So like applying different concepts in the particular model, it might result in something novel, and that's what we are like trying to do in this thing. is it the thing or something more than that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the collective models don't require they don't require much agency, or they don't require much brain power by the agents. Like, if you think about like a void, it requires very little overhead in terms of what the brain of an individual agent is doing. It's just a series of rules that are executed in parallel. And so that's the key, is like you can execute things in parallel. Then it's much more powerful potentially than like executing things like each agent kind of predicting what other agents are going to do, and then doing this, making serial moves, and then that's not really going to be, that's not going to get you where you want to be in terms of like understanding those sort of large collective behaviors. So so anyone else have anything to add to that, or? Actually, I wanted to mention, I think Z and Ankit were missing at the very beginning of the meeting, but Devansh made an announcement that he has his paper. He showed us that paper a couple weeks ago that he was working on for the ICDE conference, and Monday is going to be his presentation of this. Actually, his first paper presentation is on Monday. The conference is happening virtually. So ICD is the International Conference in Data Engineering. So is this something that people can attend?
Congrats to them.
Oh, Z, you were going to say something?
No.
Oh, okay.
I just want to say good luck.
Oh, good. Yeah. So that's, congratulations, Devansh. Yeah. So, let's see. Actually, I wanted to talk about something. Okay, this is...
I just sent a talk, so it's kind of funny. It involves DV and Game of Life. So
oh, okay.
Summit.
Let's take a look.
There's a guy who like, this was the motivation. I got some idea about what exactly Brayton vehicle does. So, big talk.
It's taking a long time to load up the synthetic biology, psychology, and Brainward vehicles under Seattle.
I am getting over a cold right now.
Yeah.
So if I
It seems like a funny comedy, but it's really informative.
Oh, yeah, okay, so this is faces on it.
Alright, is that working?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Vehicles.
Let's see. So I'm going to talk about robots, specifically Brainward vehicles. So if you guys don't have a lot of robotic experience, don't worry. It's going to be very, very simple. We're going to do just some kind of imagination, some sort of thought exercises and things like that. And if you have a lot of robotic experience, hopefully still you'll get something out of this, because it's kind of neat. Let's see, so robots are a nerdy topic for sure, but it's definitely in pop culture. And we've got movies right now about people falling in love with robots. We've got robots that clean our house and everything like that. They're very, very complicated things. If you wanted to sit down and design something like that, you might have some really complex for one neighbor.
Okay, so this is the part on... Yeah, this is the part on cellular automata. I mean, this is like 30 minutes, so I just wanted to kind of go through it a little bit.
Yeah, but then he'll come to vehicle and then he'll illustrate that very nicely.
There you go. There's Valentino Breitenberg. Then, yeah. So this is the combination of them. Actually, this is the vehicle. And go through a little bit more. This is the synthesis. I think I've seen this before. Oh yes.
I actually mentioned it in my last year's proposal. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then this is, of course, the vehicle doing its thing.
So he explains it very nicely.
Yeah. Auto correction makes the vehicle attracted to the light. Accelerates until it's the light at full speed. Let's see. Okay, so these are some of his experiments.
Yeah.
And these are robots, of course, not the computational versions. This is a couple of Bradenburg vehicles on his kitchen floor.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yes. Nice.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Thanks. So yeah, it's a nice talk. You can watch it at your leisure. The link's in the chat. I wanted to get to, let's see, I was going to do some papers, but I want to get to the MetaBrain. So I want to talk about some of the stuff that I'm getting organized for the GSoC, this summer's GSoC. And let's see, I've got this this repository called MetaBrain Models. So this is the place where I'm going to have a bunch of things. So this is the CGS stuff. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is the Contextual Neurodevelopmental Dynamics, which is the name of the project.
This is.
And yeah, and this is just a simple README in there right now, and this is kind of a description, but I would like to put stuff in this repository. And then DBV, which is Developmental Bradenburg Vehicles. So this is a different repository. We have the old repository, which is Bradenburg Vehicles, but this is Developmental Bradenburg Vehicles. So, well, let me tell you. Let me go through this all the way. This is ICMs. This is ideological connectionist model. We might not talk about this much at all this summer, but that's part of it. So the MetaBrain model is something that, okay, this was actually a repository for the 2019 Braden TC Twitter conference. So I gave a talk in there on CGS models, but integrated with something called MetaBrain models. So MetaBrain models are this idea that it, involves having like multiple models of the brain and behavior. So this was where we had, and this conference talk is disembodied here, different screen caps. But this talks about CGS as part of this MetaBrain model. So this is like the part in the proposal this year. We have the Bradenburg vehicles and the CGS models. And as I described to a couple of you, the Bradenburg vehicle is sort of the representation-free part, and it sits on the bottom, and it does the behavior and interacts with its environment, and it has a body. And the CGS is then like the representational part of the brain. So, it's almost like the, how our brain has basically three parts. This brain would have two parts. It would have like a CGS representation and a Bradenburg vehicle engine, which doesn't really have a representation, but it's a computational thing. It's a computational agent. And so this is another model. This was the ideological model that there's a repository for in here. That was part of this as well. But this summer we're going to be working on using the CGS models with Bradenburg vehicles. So that's why I have this organized the way it is. It's like we have the CGS, the DVB, the ICM, and then this is the Neurodevelopmental Dynamics folder or directory. So the README doesn't. I mean, this tells you about what this was. This reflects the Twitter conference content. So I have to update that. The README is, I think, just basically the same thing. So I'm gonna maybe decrement the abstract, or well, no, I'll keep the abstract here. Oh, this is the abstract. I'm sorry. So this is the abstract for the TC conference. The README is this sort of header for the Twitter conference. So I'm going to keep those two, but don't really pay attention to those. Pay attention to these folders, the CGS, DBV, and ICM, or just the DBV and CGS for us. And then the contextual neurodevelopmental dynamics will be for, kind of like the merging of the two. So we might have things that reflect, one model mode or the other. So if we do some work on the CGS, that's explicitly like CGS related, we'll put it in this directory. If it's explicitly developmental Bratenberg vehicles oriented, we'll put it in this directory. And then this directory, neurodevelopmental dynamics, will be for like the merging of those two models in this sort of two-layered brain, if you want to think about it that way. And then this is the meta-brain models for CGS. So this is an example of what I'm thinking for CGS. And this is where my motivation comes in, because last week I told you I would start putting some of the notes online from some of our conversations from 2018, the GSoC project. So I do have those now. So that's what these directories reflect. We have things on agent kernels, the color data set, time representations, and n-grams approach. So, for example, we in 2018 talked about using like a color space as a way to calibrate the CGS models. So you have all these color values that you can classify in different ways. And I actually found that not only can you do this, this is an easy way to kind of bootstrap the classification process without too much data, because the data is in the colors that you have. You just need like a color map and some values, and you can generate a bunch of colors, and then you can classify them. But they actually now have an open source semantic map of color names. So this is the project that's happening where they're actually naming every color in this RGB space. And so it's like you can click on a color, and it's actually a hex value, and you can name it. So that's actually kind of the goal of what we're trying to do with this CGS instance, would be that you would have like a bunch of colors, and you would give them like labels, and then you'd classify the labels as like different colors, or maybe having different meanings. So like this color might be hot, this color might be cold, this color might be angry, this color might be happy, and so forth. And this would be how the agent would classify all these things. And it would be a continuous space. Like the agent would like perceive it, as a continuous space, but each part of that space then would have like, there'd be axes of different semantic labels to it.
Yeah, so in my case, this different colors will actually correspond to different behavioral provocations of the vehicle.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like the idea of the CGS would be that you would have like a representation of that. But it could be, that's an interesting point, is that in the Bratenberg vehicle context, you would have behaviors, and we usually associate it with like what they call these taxic movements, which are like if there's a light source, the vehicle moves towards the light, it's attracted by the light source or repelled by the light source. So it's a movement towards something based on its attributes. So there are a lot of different types of taxis in nature, like light taxis and photo taxis, also chemotaxis, which are chemicals. I don't know what the odorant taxis are, but there are a bunch of them in the literature, and the idea is basically the same. If you have something in the environment, a source of something, the organism will move towards that when they sense it. And so that's basic like what the nervous system will do, in a number of animals, but it's not representational. And so the representation part would come where we could classify colors and maybe map them to behaviors. So, that I don't know how that's kind of the fun of this kind of metabrain model, is that you can see like one part of the brain is sort of building representation, and the other part is maybe it's building a different representation, or it's doing something like Bradenburg vehicles, where it's doing like a lot of the, you might call it low-level processing of the environment. So that's what we're trying to do with some of these data sets from 2018. So we had the color data set, and then we had some other, like a linguistic data set, which was based on Google Ngram. So this is something where if you're familiar with the Ngram Viewer, which is a tool you can look at different frequencies of words in like books. So the Google has a collection of books, a huge collection of books that they've digitized from 1800 to the present. And they have every word is like accounted for. And then every word is broken into engrams, which, if you're familiar with linguistics, are, if I take a word like Einstein, I can break it into like different fragments, and the fragments have to be at least 2 characters long, but they can be anywhere from 2 characters to n-1 characters. So those are your engrams. And like Einstein, the word Einstein results in like 30 or 40 engrams. I don't remember the number, but so you can put these together in different ways. It doesn't just lead to the word Einstein. It could lead to the word, Stein, or, Ein, or whatever. And so, but you can actually query either a whole word or a fragment of a word and get the frequency over time that it's been used in those books. And so you can see that, like, Sherlock Holmes wasn't used until 1850. Einstein wasn't used until about 1910, which makes sense historically. And then it has a frequency that rises to, it's not a very high frequency, but it's, compared to its historical usage, it is. And so you can look at these things. The point is that they have these Ngram data sets, which are, they have them in different languages. This is English. So they have all these English words, and they have all the engrams that you can make from those words in these files. And these are huge files, so I don't think this is something for the faint of heart data scientist. But you can actually mine these for different, for data about sort of the nature of the English language, like, the structure of the language, or, how people represent things in the language in terms of letters. And so we did this in 2018 as well. We actually spent more time on this, going through sort of a model of, like, sort of a linguistic model of classification. So this was my conversation with Sam about this. He was one of the GSoC students in 2018, and he actually applied a genetic algorithm to this problem. And so you can read about it a little bit here, and it's reflected in his project, but these are notes from like when he's trying to develop it. So that's what I'm trying to do with this in each of these little directories, is to put in some inside information about each of these concepts.
Yeah, I think it will be good that we have the data set. So I was actually about to do, like, we need much time to prepare the data set and then label and everything. So
I kind of wanted to make that simple, though. So that's why like, we had to try to find an easy way to assemble it. But you don't want to spend too much time on that. But it's something that is, I think, useful to have, just simply as a way to calibrate your model.
So anyway, I have given a lot of time in my proposal for this, yes, for even the like labeling and everything. So you must have seen that.
Yeah, I did, and I think it's something we can discuss further. We might use different examples even if it's easier. I had one on, like I was thinking, one on like biodiversity, where you classify like animal shapes, like or give them names, like things in nature. It's even broader than that. Things in nature you might find that are like, excuse me, different shapes.
Mm-hmm.
So you might find like different shapes of like say living things in the environment, and you classify them like, in every culture they classify things in nature, right? And then we have Linnaean classification, which is the way that scientists classify things. But those they call them typologies. They exist in it's a way to like distinguish things in nature, and they can include like shapes of organisms or chemical compounds or even different light sources. They all have this sort of relationship, and if you think about like in some cultures, they think of things as being all things in nature as being interrelated, and have these typologies that reflect that. That's kind of the idea is that you would have like this, your environment would be classified in a certain way, and we could create a data set conceivably that would sort of reflect that and train the model. But it might be a little hard to pull off. Just kind of giving thought to some easier things to create, like sort of a synthetic data set that we can then train the agent on.
Yeah.
So, well, we'll revisit that in coming weeks. I just wanted to point that out. I was going to talk about the CSV Conf presentation, but Jesse couldn't make it today. So hopefully Jesse's feeling better next week. But we're going to kind of keep going on that. We're getting along. I'm actually making some progress on it, putting in some organizing it a little bit better. So we'll keep working on that. Then finally, I just wanted to go over a couple papers in the last 10 minutes. I know we spent a lot of time on the Conway stuff, which is, I think, important. I think he did a lot of good work. It's interesting to see how that relates to cognition, actually, in neuroscience. But there are a couple of papers, and I'll point them out. I might not go through them. We're going to continue our discussion of double descent. And I know that, like, Devansh missed our conversation last week on double descent. But we have this folder here. So Jesse brought this paper to my attention a couple months ago. It was on this idea of the double descent curve. So you have this curve that they use in machine learning a lot. Let me see if this has it in there. So it's this curve where you have you look at the capacity of a model versus the risk of underfitting or overfitting. And the idea is that you look at so there's this inverse U curve. That means that if your model has low capacity, you're underfitting your data or your solution. And if the capacity is high, you run the risk of overfitting your solution. That's a traditional machine learning view. But a more, now with models like deep learning where you have a lot more capacity, you observe this traditional curve up to a certain amount of capacity. And then you have this interpolating regime, which is something that occurs when the model is way over capacity or there's a really high capacity, and you're no longer at risk of sort of overfitting your data, but you can over-parameterize your data. So that's the idea of the double descent curve. And this whole discussion revolved around sort of the origins of that curve and maybe how it may or may not be a reasonable way to look at it. So I think I'll save that for next week too. But I will point that out to Devansh since he wasn't here last week. So a couple of the papers that I found this week actually were a lot of papers on like deep learning and the intersection of deep learning and psychology. So two of these were, actually this one is interesting, but a review that was written recently, it's a brand new paper. It takes the concept of attention and it looks at how it's used across different subfields or different fields of inquiry. So attention is used in psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning, but the definitions aren't necessarily the same. And so this is a review of that, those differences and those similarities. So it's not clear. I mean, when machine learning people talk about attention, they're talking about attention in, like, say, a deep learning model. That may or may not correspond to how they talk about attention in psychology or neuroscience. So psychology attention is largely like something you can do a behavioral test on. You can draw people's attention to something. You can have them multitask. You can interfere with their attentional capacity. And all those things can be demonstrated with experiments. And they have their own neural mechanisms. And in neuroscience, of course, they explore those neural mechanisms. But as the paper says, attention is certainly far from a clear or unified concept. Yet despite its many vague and sometimes conflicting definitions, there is a core quality of attention that is demonstrably of high importance to information processing in the brain and increasingly artificial systems. So attention is the flexible control of limited computational resources. Why those resources are limited and how they can best be controlled will vary across use cases, but the ability to dynamically alter and route the flow of information has clear benefits for the adaptiveness of any system. So she's thinking of it, the author is thinking of it in terms of controlling resources and using information to do that control. So you're controlling the flow of information. So you have information coming in, maybe visually, visual attention, and you're trying to sort through that information. So if you took every piece of information that ever hit your retina and brought it into your brain simultaneously, that wouldn't be a very effective system of cognition. It would just be like everything hitting your retina, everything at once, and then your brain has to sort it out. I mean, that's kind of what attention is, but it's a little bit more detailed. Attention then is like where you have, so the first thing you find in attention is where you pick sort of a focus of attention. So you can focus your attention on specific things, tasks, fields of view, and so forth. And so the consequence of that is that you have what they call an attentional spotlight, which is where you can pay close attention to something like your computer screen, but you also tune out a lot of peripheral information, which is both good and bad. And so this is, I think, the core feature of attention. Now, when people talk about attention in deep learning or in machine learning, it's a different concept. And so this paper goes through how attention is used in neuroscience and psychology, their connections to arousal and alertness. So arousal can affect attention. If you're not aroused, you don't tend to pay very good attention to things. If you're highly aroused, you pay attention to something very closely. Those two things are linked. And arousal, of course, has other autonomic or physiological indicators and consequences. So there's a lot of linkage between, like, your sort of your nervous system, they call it the autonomic nervous system, but it's really just like your heart rate and things like that sort of make you really alert or not. When you're sleeping or when you're awake, those sorts of things can affect your attention, and so they're tightly linked. This network of attention, which involves a lot of different areas of the brain. And so then you compare that with something like the way they use it in machine learning, which is very different. They don't use the same type of, so attention even has links to memory. And attention has links to executive control, which is control, like, making movements, like goal-directed movements, like reaching for a cup. The attention has consequences in all of that. But when we think about it in machine learning, it's very different. We talk about attention as a limited resource. We talk about, so the specific job of an attention mechanism in machine learning is to produce a set of scalar weightings, one for each of the encoded vectors v. At each step t, the attention mechanism will take in information about the decoder's previous hidden state and the encoded vectors to produce an unnormalized weighting. And so they think about attention as largely about where to focus attention on different features, which is kind of what the brain does, but it's in a much different way. It's in a statistical way, purely. And it doesn't have a lot of dependence on other modules of the deep learning network, at least not the way people have been applying it. And so, I mean, it's a you could say that the machine learning instance is a metaphor, right? So here, but it's not what we think of attention as in the brain. And so I think this is a very nice publication making that distinction in how people even use it in natural language processing. And so the distinction of how it's used in AI versus how it's used in biology or in psychology. And so this is a very good review. I'm not going to spend any more time on it, but you can read it at your own leisure. The other paper I wanted to bring your attention to in the last couple minutes is this paper, Shortcut Learning in Deep Neural Networks. So this, again, is about learning. And they actually make the case here that, what is it about deep learning that is, makes it learning? Or compared to, learning in psychology or in neuroscience, what do they have in common? Why is deep learning effective, and why is learning in general effective? And they come to the conclusion that a lot of what we find in deep learning is this idea of shortcut learning. So shortcut learning is there are decision rules that perform well on standard benchmarks, but fail to transfer to more challenging testing conditions. So in the real world, we don't necessarily use shortcut learning as a default type of learning. There are all sorts of learning in the real world: declarative learning, automatic shot learning, fear learning, these sorts of things. But they use different mechanisms. What we tend to use in artificial systems is something called shortcut learning, which is where you find something that, you find some, almost like a correlative relationship, and you exploit that. But it's not very robust, and it doesn't really transfer well. People study transfer learning in artificial neural networks or in other areas of machine learning, but that isn't the default. The default is this shortcut learning. And so they talk about this in the paper about you can set up a toy example of shortcut learning in neural networks. So they train a simple data set on stars and moons, which is this top row, identifying stars versus moons. And then in a test where you look at what they call the IID, which is the main mode of a normal distribution. So it's what you call the bell curve, and it's the instances that fall within the main mode of the bell curve. So the most common instances distributed independently, but in this bell curve. And then they also have another test where it's out of distribution test. So these are the instances that fall on the tails of this normal distribution. So these are the outliers. And so they tested on outliers as well. And so when trained on a simple data set, a standard neural network of 3 layers can easily categorize and make this distinction. However, testing it on a different data set, which is this out of distribution data set, reveals a shortcut strategy. The network has learned to associate object location with a category. During training, stars were always shown in the top right or bottom left of an image. Moons in the top left or bottom right. So you can see that here. And so it's using this rule because it's observing these outliers. It's using a shortcut rule to make a generalization. But the generalization isn't very robust because it's not really based on, it's like if you have you don't have a lot of data with outliers, so you have to sort of generalize. But because they're outliers, they don't generalize well. And that's kind of the point. So you can see the pattern from the toy example in the IID test set, which makes sense because you have more normalized data. You have a distribution that has the typical range of things. So that's the idea of shortcut learning. That's the paper.
Sorry, I don't quite get it here. What is the outlier for the start and?
Oh, the outlier is where you have. So the outlier is where the star is presented in different parts of this box, and so is the moon. So they could be in any corner, right? So you're training it on that, and you're finding, like, I guess the most common occurrence. So on the IAD test set, you find the stars in different corners, but in the OOD test set, which is the out of distribution, you find it in either in this corner or in this corner. So it's like,
so the network has not seen that location before, right?
No, that they're just learning from the data. It's not seeing the location. But the thing is, in the out of distribution test set, you only see a subset of all the possible locations. So it doesn't know that there are like a full range of locations. So to compensate for that, there's a shortcut rule, which is where you have this, like it's just making an association, which is erroneous when you compare it to the larger data set that says it's either in one place or another, because that's all it's ever seen.
I see.
Yeah. And so this paper, I don't know how controversial it's going to be, but it talks about how it happens often in machine learning, and how it's not really the way biological learning works, but it's they make the comparisons with biology and with psychology, and so it's a good paper to go over. If you want to read more about these papers, I will share the Google Drive location here, and you can go through the papers. If you need permissions, just send me a message on that. So that was a lot of stuff to cover in 1 hour, but I think it's a pretty good meeting. I had some good conversations here. The top of the hour. So next week, hopefully Jesse can make it. We'll talk about the CSV Conf slides. Jesse and I might meet some other time during the week too to talk about it. Also, we'll maybe revisit the MetaBrain models repositories to sort of plan out for GSoC what we want to populate those with. I'll probably put more instances of conversations we've had in the past on that. So we'll have kind of like an FAQ where people can go and look up specific things. And then, we'll probably have more papers next week, but that's it for now. Any questions on anything?
Yeah, so we have almost 2 weeks, exactly 2 weeks till the results get out. So, and is there any change of timeline in that beforehand or something like that in the GSoC plan?
Oh, well, they did change the timeline a while back, and I think if you look up what you did for your project proposal, I think reflects the change that they made. So they did.
Yeah, so there was just one change that happened a month ago, perhaps.
Yeah, that's all I know of. I think that's going to be the change for the summer. I think they added a week or two, and then so in case people get sick or something, there's it's a little bit more flexible. But as far as I know, there are no other changes. And I think the standards will be a little bit more lax too. And I don't mean that to say you don't want to do your best, but I think if people get sick or if something happens over the summer with respect to cancellations or whatever, they want to be they want to build that in. So, but well, yeah, I mean, we'll I think when we get to the community period, I think that's going to be like a lot of maybe discussions about open source stuff. We've been talking about in this group, but maybe a little bit more about open source software and open science, and then also talk more about like the project, like how to set up for the project, data sets, and that.
Nice.
Yeah.
So, anyway, thanks.
Yeah. So that's all I have. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thanks for attending the meeting. Hope you all stay safe and healthy this week.
Yeah.
And talk to you guys later.
Thanks.
Bye.